Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a figure who walks between the cracks of the Imperium. He moves through shadows that even the Inquisition cannot illuminate. He slips between the fingers of the most determined hunters the galaxy has ever produced, leaving nothing behind but questions, smoldering worlds, and the faint scent of gunpowder and betrayal. He has been hunted for 10,000 years. He has been captured, imprisoned, and locked away in cells from which no being has ever escaped, and yet he walks free. He has fought alongside heroes and stood in the company of monsters. He has saved the Imperium and brought it to the brink of ruin. He carries a sword on his back that he has never drawn in combat, a blade that may hold the key to humanity's salvation or its final damnation. His name, if it can even be called a name, is Cipher. And before we go any further, let me say something about that name, because it is important. A cipher, in the old Terran languages, meant a code, a puzzle, a way of hiding meaning behind symbols that only the initiated could decipher. It also meant a zero, a nothing, a blank space where a number or a letter should be. Both definitions are appropriate for the figure we are about to discuss. He is a code that no one has cracked. He is a zero at the center of an equation that changes the value of everything around it. He is nothing and everything simultaneously, a void that shapes the universe by the very fact of its existence. And he has been doing this for 10,000 years. 10,000 years. Let that number settle into your mind for a moment. It is almost impossible for the human brain to truly comprehend such a span of time. 10,000 years ago, on ancient Terra, humanity was just beginning to develop agriculture. The great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia would not arise for another 5,000 years. The Roman Empire, the Renaissance, the Age of Strife, the Emperor's Great Crusade, all of these were still deep in the future. And yet, for the entirety of that incomprehensible duration, a single hooded figure has been walking the galaxy, fighting, scheming, evading, carrying a sword he will not draw toward a destination he has never reached. The patience alone is enough to inspire awe or terror, depending on your perspective. Welcome back. Settle in, get comfortable, because today we are going to take a long, slow walk through one of the deepest and most fascinating rabbit holes in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. We are going to talk about a character so mysterious that even the writers at Games Workshop have admitted they may never fully reveal the truth about him. We are going to explore his origins on a world that no longer exists, follow his trail across 10,000 years of galactic warfare, examine the sword he carries but never wields, and try to answer the question that has haunted fans and fictional characters alike for decades. Who is Cipher, and what does he really want? To understand Cipher, you have to understand the world that made him. And to understand that world, you have to go back. Far, far back. Back to a time before the Imperium was broken, before the great betrayal that tore humanity's empire in half, and back to a planet called Caliban, and the knightly brotherhood that would one day become the most secretive chapter of space marines in the entire galaxy. So close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a world wrapped in endless forest. Not the gentle woodlands of some pastoral paradise, but something older and darker and infinitely more dangerous. Imagine trees so vast and so ancient that their canopies blot out the sun entirely, leaving the forest floor in a perpetual twilight where monstrous things prowl and hunt and feed. Imagine a civilization clinging to existence inside fortress monasteries of cold grey stone, surrounded on all sides by a wilderness that wants nothing more than to devour them whole. That was Caliban. And that was the world where our story begins. I'm at part 1, The Order of Caliban and the Birth of a Title. Caliban was classified by the Imperium as a death world, and it earned that designation in every conceivable way. The planet sat in the Segmentum Obscurus, uncomfortably close to what would later be known as the Eye of Terror. And that proximity to the galaxy's greatest wound in reality had consequences. The forests that covered Caliban's surface were infested with creatures that the inhabitants called the Great Beasts. These were not ordinary predators. They were things twisted and mutated by the touch of chaos itself, warped by energies seeping through from the Imperium into the fabric of reality. They were monsters, in the truest sense of the word, and they made life on Caliban a constant, grinding struggle for survival. But the humans who inhabited this dark and deadly world had developed a culture to match their environment. Cut off from the rest of humanity during the long nightmare of the Age of Strife, when warp storms made interstellar travel all but impossible, Caliban's population had regressed to a feudal state. Society organized itself around fortified settlements and castle keeps, and the defense of these holdings fell to organizations of warrior knights who dedicated their lives to pushing back the darkness that pressed in from the forest. These knightly orders were the backbone of Calibanite civilization. They recruited the bravest and most capable individuals, trained them in the arts of war, and sent them out into the wilderness to hunt the great beasts and protect the scattered human communities that depended on them for survival. Among these orders, one stood above the rest. It was known simply as the Order, and it was renowned across Caliban for the integrity and martial skill of its members. The Order was unusual in many respects. Unlike many of the noble houses and knightly brotherhoods that dominated Calibanite society, the Order did not select its members based on bloodline or inheritance. Instead, it recruited purely on the basis of merit and martial ability. This made it something of an oddity in a society where heredity was everything, but it also made it formidably effective. The best fighters, the sharpest minds, the most dedicated warriors found their way to the Order regardless of their birth. But the Order had another distinction that is far more relevant to our story. Among its many positions of authority and ritual significance, yet there existed a role unlike any other. It bore various arcane titles across different periods of Caliban's history: Master of Mysteries, Keeper of the Truth, the Lord of the Keys. But the most enduring name, the one that would echo across 10,000 years of history and become synonymous with the galaxy's greatest enigma, was Lord Cipher. The title of Lord Cipher was one of the most important offices within the Order. To ensure that their proud traditions were maintained across generations, the ruling masters of the Order secretly selected a single member to assume this role. The process was shrouded in ceremony and gravitas, and the person chosen was expected to make a sacrifice that went far beyond the physical dangers of fighting great beasts in the darkened forests. Upon taking the title, yet the Lord Cipher was required to renounce his own name, completely and utterly. He gave up his identity, his personal history, his connections to family and friends. He shrouded his very appearance beneath a cloak and hood, and from that day forward, it was forbidden for anyone to acknowledge who he had been before. The Lord Cipher ceased to exist as an individual and became instead the living embodiment of the Order's laws, customs, and traditions. He was no longer a man. He was a principle made flesh, a walking symbol of everything the Order stood for and everything it demanded of its members. This was not merely ceremonial. The Lord Cipher served a vital practical function. He was the keeper of the Order's secrets and traditions, responsible for ensuring that the ancient rituals and practices were maintained without deviation. He advised the masters on all matters of protocol and officiated at many important ceremonies. He was the institutional memory of the Order, the living archive who ensured that the passage of time did not erode the standards and ideals upon which the Brotherhood had been founded. The Order took this position extremely seriously, and for good reason. It was understood by the wise among them that the nature of the galaxy was to decay, that structures inevitably collapsed, that traditions faded and ideals were forgotten unless someone stood constant vigil against that erosion. The Lord Cipher was that vigil. He was the guardian against entropy, the sentinel who watched over the soul of the Order itself. Now keep this in mind as we go forward, because this idea, this concept of a figure who exists between identities, who abandons his own name and history to serve a higher purpose, who moves through the world as a guardian of secrets and a keeper of hidden truths, that concept is absolutely central to understanding everything that comes after. The modern Cipher, the one who stalks through the 41st millennium, leaving fire and confusion in his wake, embodies many of these ancient principles, even though the direct connection between the two has never been definitively established. Let us talk now about two specific individuals who held this title, because their stories set the stage for everything that follows. The first was an elderly human who served as Lord Cipher during the earliest known period of the Order's history, when Lionel Johnson and Luther were just beginning their legendary campaign to unite Caliban and cleanse its forests of the great beasts. This Cipher was a mortal man, unaugmented by the genetic enhancements that would later create the superhuman space marines. He was a scholar and a keeper of knowledge, and he advised both the Lion and Luther during the great campaign that would eventually rid Caliban of the monsters that plagued it. He died a few years after the coming of the Imperium and the Emperor to Caliban, passing away in the natural course of human mortality. His story, while important for establishing the lineage of the title, is relatively straightforward. The second Lord Cipher is where things get complicated. And in the world of the Dark Angels, complicated is putting it mildly. This younger Lord Cipher came to his position as a mortal human, but became a Dark Angel space marine during the recruitment period that followed the Imperium's discovery of Caliban. He was a figure of considerable mystery even before the heresy. Two respected members of the Order, Sardaviel and Master Remiel, claimed that this particular Lord Cipher was the last surviving member of the Knights of Lupus, another Calibanite knightly order that Lionel Johnson had utterly destroyed during his unification campaign. The Knights of Lupus were themselves an unusual organization. While most of the knightly orders dedicated themselves to hunting and killing the great beasts, the Knights of Lupus took a different approach. They sought to preserve these creatures, viewing them as an integral part of Caliban's identity and ecosystem. And more disturbingly, they had accumulated a library of knowledge about the warp, chaos, and the dark forces that had created the beasts in the first place. When the Lion ordered their destruction, it was partly because of this dangerous knowledge, this flirtation with powers that should have been left alone. If the Lord Cipher was indeed the last knight of Lupus, it raises fascinating questions about why the Lion would have elevated such a person to one of the most trusted positions in the Order. Some theorists suggest that the Lion recognized this individual's unique knowledge of Caliban's dark secrets and wanted him close, where he could both utilize that knowledge and keep a watchful eye on its keeper. Others propose that the Lion saw in this young knight a loyalty that transcended his destroyed order, and a loyalty that could be redirected and put to use in service of a greater cause. But here is where the narrative thickens further. The Horus Heresy novel, Angels of Caliban, presents this Lord Cipher as an ally of the Watchers in the Dark, those mysterious, diminutive, hooded entities that have been associated with Caliban since before human memory. The Watchers are strange beings, possibly Xenos, possibly something else entirely, but one thing is clear about them. They are implacably opposed to chaos. They have spent millennia working to contain the warp taint that infects Caliban at its very core, and they do not ally themselves with servants of the dark gods. This creates a problem with the Knight of Lupus theory, because the Knights of Lupus were, at least in part, dedicated to preserving creatures born from chaos corruption. Their library contained texts related to the warp and its powers. An ally of the Watchers in the Dark would almost certainly be an enemy of everything the Knights of Lupus represented. Furthermore, the librarian Zahariel was able to recognize this Lord Cipher after removing his helmet, which would have been extremely unlikely if the Cipher was truly a former Knight of Lupus, since Zahariel had no known prior relationship with members of that order. So already, before we even reach the heresy and the fall of Caliban, the identity of the Lord Cipher is wrapped in contradiction and mystery. The historical record says one thing, the narrative evidence suggests another, and the truth, if there even is a single truth to be found, remains hidden beneath layers of deliberate obfuscation and the fog of 10,000 years of war. Again, there is a third figure who bore this title, and his story may be the most important of all. Zahariel el-Zurias was a Dark Angel's space marine during the Great Crusade, a native of Caliban who had been recruited into the order as a child alongside his cousin, Nemiel. Zahariel was remarkable for several reasons. He was a powerful psyker, a librarian of considerable talent, and he had a deep connection to the mysteries of Caliban that went beyond what most of his brothers understood. During the events leading up to the heresy, the previous Lord Cipher attempted to have Zahariel killed during an internal power struggle, a kind of coup that erupted as the political situation on Caliban deteriorated. Zahariel survived, and in the aftermath, Luther himself promoted Zahariel to the position of Lord Cipher. From that point forward, Zahariel bore the title, the hood, and all the weight of its ancient responsibilities. Now, Zahariel's story is fascinating in its own right, and it bears directly on the question of who the modern Cipher might be. Zahariel was one of the fallen. He joined Luther's rebellion against the Imperium, though his reasons were more complex than simple treachery. He had discovered the truth about Caliban's warp taint, and he believed that the planet and its people needed to be protected from the consequences of that taint, even if it meant defying the authority of distant terror. When the modern Cipher was captured by the Dark Angels during one of his rare periods of imprisonment, and he spoke a specific code word, Starfire. This was the code word that had been used to activate the orbital defense weapons against Lion L. Johnson's fleet when the Lion returned to Caliban after the heresy. At the time of its creation, that code word was known to only 4 individuals: Luther, Astellan, Griffane, and Zahariel. This is a tantalizing piece of evidence. If the modern Cipher knows this code word, it strongly suggests that he is one of those 4 people. Luther is accounted for, having been imprisoned beneath the rock for 10,000 years before his recent escape. Astellan and Griffane have their own documented histories, which leaves Zahariel as a prime candidate for the identity of the figure who has been haunting the galaxy under the name Cipher for 10 millennia. But as with everything related to this character, while the evidence is never conclusive, it is always tantalizing but never definitive, always suggestive but never certain. Games Workshop has built their greatest mystery on the principle that every answer raises 2 new questions, and every clue points in at least 3 different directions simultaneously. The title of Lord Cipher, then, is not simply a name. It is a legacy. It is a mantle that has been worn by multiple individuals across the centuries, each one surrendering their identity to become something larger than themselves. And it is this very quality, this tradition of anonymity and self-erasure, that makes the modern Cipher so impossibly difficult to pin down. He is not just a man hiding behind a name. He is a concept wearing a man's shape, a tradition given flesh and blood and purpose, moving through the galaxy with intentions that no one, perhaps not even Cipher himself, fully understands. And it is with this understanding, this foundation in the ancient traditions of Caliban and the Order, that we must now turn to the event that changed everything. The catastrophe that shattered a world, scattered an entire brotherhood across time and space, and set a hooded figure on a 10,000-year journey toward a destination that remains, to this day, unknown. It is time to talk about the fall of Caliban. Part 2. The fall of Caliban. When the world broke apart. To understand the fall of Caliban, you first have to understand the slow, poisonous process that led to it. Because worlds do not break apart overnight. Betrayals of this magnitude are not born in a moment of rage or a single bad decision. And they are cultivated over years, fed by resentment and nourished by misunderstanding, watered by silence and shade, until they grow into something monstrous enough to crack the foundations of reality itself. The seeds were planted during the Great Crusade, that vast military undertaking in which the Emperor of Mankind sent his 20 Primarchs and their Space Marine legions out across the galaxy to reunite the scattered remnants of human civilization. Lion L. Johnson, the Primarch of the Dark Angels and the First Legion, was among the most effective of these conquerors. He was brilliant, ruthless, and possessed of a tactical mind that could unravel the most complex military problems with almost inhuman precision. But the Lion had a flaw, and it was a flaw that would cost him everything. He kept secrets. He hoarded information the way a dragon hoards gold, clutching it close and sharing it with no one, not even those who needed it most. He operated on the assumption that knowledge was power, and that the best way to maintain power was to ensure that no one else had access to the same knowledge he possessed. This might have been an effective strategy against enemies, but the Lion applied it to his allies as well, and the results were catastrophic. When the Emperor came to Caliban and recognized Lionel Johnson as his lost son, the Primarch was given command of the First Legion of Space Marines, the force that had been created from his own genetic template. But the Emperor also saw the potential in Caliban's existing warrior culture, and many of the Order's knights were inducted into the Dark Angels as new recruits. Among them was Luther, as the Lion's closest companion, and the man who had essentially raised him after his discovery in the forests as a feral child. Luther was a remarkable individual in his own right. Before the Lion's arrival on Caliban, Luther had been the greatest hero of his generation, a knight of legendary skill and courage whose name was spoken with reverence across the entire planet. But the arrival of the Emperor and the creation of the Space Marines changed everything. Luther received the genetic enhancements that transformed him into something more than human, but because of his age, the process was not as complete as it was for younger recruits. He was stronger and faster than any ordinary man, but he would never be a full Space Marine. He would never be what the Lion was. Well, this might have been bearable if the Lion had handled the situation with wisdom and compassion. But wisdom and compassion were not the Lion's strongest qualities. Instead, what Luther got was a slowly widening gulf between himself and his former protege, a growing sense that he was being left behind, diminished, pushed aside in favor of younger and more capable warriors who bore the Lion's genetic legacy more completely than he ever could. The breaking point came during the campaign against the Sarosh, an alien civilization that had secretly worshipped chaos while pretending to accept the imperial truth. The Sarosh managed to smuggle a nuclear warhead onto the Lion's flagship, and Luther discovered the plot. For one terrible, pivotal moment, Luther hesitated. His jealousy of the Lion, his resentment at being overshadowed, his growing sense of alienation from the brother he had once loved, all of these dark feelings surged up in him, and for a heartbeat he considered letting the bomb detonate and taking the Lion with it. He did not. Luther's loyalty won out over his darker impulses, and he acted to save the Lion's life. But somehow, the Lion sensed the hesitation. He saw the shadow that had crossed Luther's heart, and he could not forgive it. In the aftermath, Luther and a large number of other Dark Angels, many of them veterans from Caliban who had known Luther since before the coming of the Emperor, were sent back to their homeworld. Officially, they were tasked with recruitment and training. In reality, everyone understood what it truly was. Banishment, exile, a punishment disguised as duty. Luther was devastated. But he was also a man of enormous capability and determination. He threw himself into his new role with all the energy and dedication he possessed, recruiting and training new Space Marines for the Dark Angels at a rate that exceeded all expectations. Under his leadership, Caliban produced a staggering number of new Astartes, building up the Legion's strength, even as the Lion led the bulk of the force across the galaxy in the Great Crusade. But the isolation ate at Luther. The resentment grew, and as the years passed and the Lion showed no sign of welcoming his old mentor back to the front lines, Luther began to listen to voices that he should have rejected. Caliban, it turned out, harbored a darkness far older and far more dangerous than the great beasts that roamed its forests. The planet itself was tainted by chaos, corrupted at its very core by warp energies that had seeped into its bedrock over millennia. The great beasts were not simply natural predators that had been twisted by some unfortunate cosmic accident. They were symptoms of a disease that went all the way down to the planet's foundations. Luther discovered this truth, and it terrified him. He became convinced that the Emperor knew about Caliban's taint and would eventually order the planet's destruction. He believed that the lion had deliberately left him and his men on a world that was marked for annihilation, that their exile was not merely punishment, but a death sentence carried out in slow motion. Whether this belief was justified, or whether it was the paranoid fantasy of a man already succumbing to chaos influence, is one of those questions that the lore deliberately refuses to answer clearly. What is clear is that Luther began to dabble in powers he should have left alone. He read from the forbidden books of the destroyed Knights of Lupus, texts that contained knowledge of the warp and its entities. He experimented with sorcery, attempting to bind the dark forces of Caliban to his will in order to protect the planet and its people from the destruction he believed was coming. And as his power grew, so did his ambition and his anger. When the Horus heresy erupted across the galaxy, Luther saw his opportunity. He declared Caliban independent from the Imperium, claiming that the lion had betrayed them by abandoning them on a doomed world while he gallivanted across the stars. He was careful to distinguish his rebellion from the broader heresy. He never formally allied with Horus or the other traitor legions, but the practical effect was the same. A significant portion of the Dark Angels Legion, those who had been left behind on Caliban, followed Luther into rebellion. During these years, the Lord Cipher, whoever held that title at this particular moment, served as one of Luther's closest advisors. The Cipher had access to Luther during his periods of isolation and deliberation. He was present at the key moments when decisions were made that would determine the fate of millions. And yet, true to the enigmatic nature of the title he bore, and his own loyalties and motivations during this period, remain frustratingly unclear. There are hints that the Lord Cipher may have been working against Luther, even while serving as his advisor. His connection to the Watchers in the Dark, those anti-chaos entities who had maintained a silent vigil over Caliban's dark secrets for millennia, suggests that he may have been playing a far deeper game than anyone realized. During the Horus heresy, the Lord Cipher assisted in a prison break that freed Garviel Loken, a former member of the Sons of Horus, who had been sent to Caliban as an agent of Malcador the Sigillite to determine Luther's allegiance. Working alongside Iacton Cruz, an old friend from the Great Crusade era, the Cipher helped exfiltrate both men from Luther's dungeons. This is significant. If the Lord Cipher was truly committed to Luther's rebellion, why would he help an agent of the Sigillite escape? Why would he risk his own position and possibly his life to free someone whose mission was to gather intelligence on Luther's treachery? The answer, perhaps, is that the Lord Cipher was never truly committed to Luther at all. He was playing his own game, pursuing his own objectives, maintaining his own vigil over secrets and traditions that transcended the petty power struggles of mortals and demigods alike. When Loken and Cruz offered the Cipher the opportunity to join Malcador's Knights Errant, an elite group of agents drawn from across the legions to serve the Sigillite's secret agendas, the Cipher refused. He would serve in the shadows, he said, loyal but unremembered. It is a phrase that perfectly encapsulates the character we know today, a figure who operates at the margins of history, influencing events from the shadows, leaving his mark on the galaxy without ever stepping fully into the light. And then came the end. When the Horus heresy was over, when Horus lay dead at the Emperor's feet on the deck of his battle barge, and the traitor legions were fleeing into the Eye of Terror, the Dark Angels turned their attention homeward. They had been among the last to reach Terra, arriving too late to participate in the final defense of the Imperial Palace, a fact that would haunt them for millennia. But as they made their way back to Caliban, expecting to find their homeworld waiting to welcome them as returning heroes, they found something else entirely. They found guns pointed at them. The orbital defense batteries of Caliban opened fire on the Dark Angels fleet as it approached. Luther had given the order. Whether he was acting out of madness, out of conviction that the lion was the true traitor, or out of simple, desperate awareness that there was no going back from what he had done, the result was the same. The Dark Angels were fired upon by their own brothers, and the fury of the Lion at this betrayal was beyond description. Lionel Johnson ordered a sustained orbital bombardment of the traitor positions, and then teleported down to the planet's surface to confront Luther personally. What followed was a duel that mirrored, in its tragic intensity, the confrontation between the Emperor and Horus that had ended the heresy. Two men who had once been as close as father and son, mentor and student, brother and brother, tearing at each other with powers that were never meant to be turned inward. Luther had grown immensely powerful through his sorcerous experiments. The dark energies of Caliban and the blessings of the Chaos Gods had transformed him into something that could stand against a Primarch, at least for a time. Their battles shook the very foundations of the planet. Psychic blasts and devastating physical blows rained down as the two combatants fought with a fury born of betrayal and heartbreak. In the end, Luther proved the stronger, or at least the more desperate. He unleashed a blast of warp-spawned power that struck the Lion down, mortally wounding the Primarch. But the moment the blow landed, something broke inside Luther. The madness and the fury that had sustained him through years of rebellion and sorcery suddenly shattered, and he saw clearly what he had done. He had struck down his oldest friend, his surrogate son, the man he had pulled from the forests of Caliban and raised as his own. Luther collapsed, weeping, broken by the weight of his own sins. And in that moment of vulnerability, the Chaos Gods made their move. Denied the complete victory they had sought, the dark powers unleashed a warp storm of titanic proportions. The storm tore into the fabric of reality around Caliban, ripping the planet apart from within. The surface cracked and shattered, continents broke free and tumbled into the void, and the traitor Dark Angels, Luther's fallen, were sucked into the warp and scattered across time and space. Read that again, across time and space. Not just flung to random locations throughout the galaxy, but hurled backward and forward through time itself. In some of the fallen emerged thousands of years in the past. Others materialized in the far future. Some appeared only moments after the destruction of Caliban, finding themselves adrift in the rubble field that was all that remained of their homeworld. The warp storm did not simply disperse them. It shattered the very fabric of their existence, spreading them across the entirety of the Imperium like seeds cast into a hurricane. This is one of the most important details in the entire Cipher story, because it explains, or at least partially explains, how a single individual could appear at different points in the galaxy across a span of 10,000 years. If the fallen were scattered through time as well as space, then Cipher's seemingly impossible longevity and his habit of appearing and disappearing without warning take on a very different character. He might not be immortal at all. He might simply be out of sequence, experiencing time in a non-linear fashion, jumping or drifting from one era to another as the warp currents carry him. Or he might be something else entirely, because there is another possibility that we need to consider. The title of Lord Cipher, as we discussed, was always meant to be inherited. When one Cipher died or was unable to continue, another was selected to take his place. The new Cipher abandoned his old identity and assumed the mantle, the hood, and all the accumulated secrets and responsibilities of his predecessor. If this tradition continued among the fallen, if the title was passed from one individual to another across the millennia, then the Cipher who appears in the 41st millennium might not be the same person who held the title during the fall of Caliban at all. He might be the latest in a long line of bearers, each one inheriting the equipment, the mission, and the mystery of those who came before. This is the genius of the character, from a narrative perspective. Every piece of evidence that seems to point toward a definitive answer also opens up new avenues of doubt. Every clue that appears to resolve the mystery instead deepens it. And this deliberate ambiguity is not a failure of storytelling. It is the story itself. Cipher is mystery. He is the question that resists all answers, the shadow that cannot be pinned to any single source of light. When the dust settled, as when the warp storm finally subsided, and the surviving loyal Dark Angels could take stock of what had happened, they found a scene of absolute devastation. Caliban was gone. The beautiful, deadly world with its ancient forests and its towering fortress monasteries had been reduced to a field of tumbling rubble, a graveyard of broken stone and shattered dreams hanging in the cold void of space. All that remained was a single chunk of rock, the largest surviving fragment of the planet, and clinging to its surface like a barnacle on a ship's hull was the fortress monastery of Alduruk, the original seat of the Order, the place where generations of knights had trained and prayed and fought and died. It had survived the destruction of the world around it, though barely, and the Dark Angels would rebuild it, reinforce it, and eventually transform it into their mobile fortress monastery.
Now, I want to take a quick moment here to give you my honest take on all of this. Out of every single character in the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe, Cipher is the one that keeps me up at night. And I mean that. I have spent way too many hours going back and forth on whether this guy is the Imperium's last hope or its final nail in the coffin. Personally, I lean toward him being loyal, or at least his own twisted version of loyal. The fact that the Emperor himself said not yet instead of never tells me everything I need to know. You do not say not yet to someone you consider an enemy. You say it to someone who is early, and that distinction matters. I also think Games Workshop will never fully reveal who he is under that hood, and honestly, I hope they do not. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. This is what makes them powerful. Right? But anyways, let's get back to the video.
They called it the Tower of Angels, but it was more commonly known by a simpler, more evocative name, the Rock. Luther was found among the ruins, alive, but utterly broken, his mind shattered by the realization of what he had done. The Dark Angels took him prisoner and chained him in the deepest, most secure cell within the rock, guarded by the Watchers in the dark and known only to the Supreme Grand Master of the chapter. He would remain there for 10,000 years, raving and weeping and occasionally coherent enough to deliver cryptic prophecies, insisting that the lion would return and that only before his Primarch would he ever repent. The lion himself had vanished, mortally wounded by Luther's final attack. Where he had been spirited away by the Watchers in the dark to a hidden chamber deep within the rock, where he was placed in a kind of stasis, his wounds slowly healing over the millennia. This was perhaps the greatest secret of all, greater even than the existence of the Fallen, because it meant that one of the Emperor's own sons, one of the 20 Primarchs, was alive and hidden within the Dark Angel's own fortress, and no one outside the most elite inner circle of the chapter knew the truth. But the Fallen were out there, scattered across the galaxy and across time. Thousands of Dark Angels who had turned against their Primarch and their Emperor were now loose in the Imperium. Some had been genuine traitors, true servants of chaos, who had embraced corruption willingly and enthusiastically. Others had been merely confused, caught up in Luther's rebellion without fully understanding what they were doing. And some, perhaps, had been loyal all along, their apparent treason the result of circumstance and misunderstanding rather than malice. For the Dark Angels, this was an existential crisis. If the truth about the Fallen became widely known, if the Imperium at large discovered that the First Legion, the Emperor's own chosen, had harbored traitors within their ranks, the consequences would be unimaginable. The Dark Angels would be disgraced, possibly disbanded, potentially destroyed. Their gene seed would be suspect, their successor chapters tainted by association, their entire legacy reduced to ash. And so the Dark Angels did what the Lion himself would have done. They kept secrets, they destroyed records, they fabricated cover stories. Yet when the time came to divide the old legions into smaller chapters during the Second Founding, the Dark Angels claimed that their records had been damaged in a plasma reactor overload during the outfitting of the rock. It was a lie, of course. They had destroyed those records themselves, meticulously eliminating every trace of evidence that might lead outsiders to the truth about Caliban. and its betrayal. From that day forward, the hunt for the fallen became the Dark Angels' supreme purpose, their sacred duty, their all-consuming obsession. Every fallen angel who remained at large was a living threat to the chapter's secret, a walking bomb that could detonate their carefully maintained facade at any moment. The Dark Angels organized themselves accordingly, as creating specialized formations dedicated to tracking down and capturing or killing their wayward brothers. The Death Wing, the elite first company of Terminator armored veterans. The Raven Wing, the fast-moving second company who served as scouts and hunters. The Interrogator Chaplains, fearsome warrior priests who extracted confessions and repentance from captured fallen before granting them the mercy of death. And above them all, controlling the hunt and guarding its secrets, was the Inner Circle, a shadowy organization within the chapter. The Inner Circle consisted of those Dark Angels who had been judged worthy of knowing the terrible truth about their chapter's past. Membership was not determined by rank alone. Some high-ranking officers were never inducted, as if the chaplains harbored even the slightest doubt about their ability to bear the weight of the knowledge. Others were brought in relatively early in their careers if they demonstrated the combination of loyalty, discretion, and moral fortitude that the Inner Circle demanded. It was the Inner Circle that coordinated the hunt for the fallen across the entire breadth of the Imperium. It was the Inner Circle that maintained the Dark Angels' network of unforgiven successor chapters, all of whom shared the terrible secret and contributed to the hunt. And it was the Inner Circle that first identified the most dangerous, the most elusive, and the most maddening of all the fallen, the one they called Cipher. Chapter Part 3. The Forgotten Wars. First Blood against the Hooded Ghost. The Dark Angels first encountered the figure known as Cipher during a period of Imperial history so thoroughly suppressed that it is known only to the highest echelons of the Inner Circle. It is called the Forgotten Wars, and it stretches across roughly 5 decades, from approximately 580 in the 31st millennium to 632 in the 32nd millennium. During this time, the newly formed Unforgiven chapters, the Dark Angels, and their successor organizations fought a series of brutal engagements that would cost them dearly and leave scars that would never fully heal. It began, as so many disasters do, with something that seemed routine. Elements of the Angels of Vengeance, one of the Dark Angels' successor chapters, were pursuing the remnants of an orc fleet through the Gothic sector. Under the guise of scanning for green-skinned stragglers, they were also following standard Unforgiven procedure, using the opportunity to quietly search for any signs of the fallen. This dual-purpose approach to military operations was standard practice for all Unforgiven chapters. Every deployment, every mission, every patrol was simultaneously a covert operation in the eternal hunt. What the Angels of Vengeance found was far more significant than scattered orc raiders. Their scans detected an encrypted signal emanating from the mining world of Lemnos. To ordinary Imperial forces, the signal would have been meaningless background noise. But the Unforgiven had spent centuries developing methods to detect the telltale signs of fallen activity. And this signal bore all the hallmarks they had learned to watch for. Further investigation led them to a pair of worlds deep within the Gothic sector, Cocytus I and Cocytus II. Named, appropriately enough, after one of the rivers of the ancient Terran underworld. These planets sat perilously close to the Eye of Terror, and the warp energies that leaked from that great wound in reality had corrupted much of their surface. The Angels of Vengeance discovered something alarming on these worlds. Not just isolated fallen, but what appeared to be an entire enclave of traitors, cultists, mutants, and renegades, all operating under the influence or protection of entities connected to the original betrayal on Caliban. The Angels of Vengeance called for reinforcements, and Supreme Grandmaster Person of the Dark Angels answered with everything he could muster. The Angels of Redemption joined the hunt. 3 companies of the Angels of Vengeance deployed, and the entire chapter of the Lion Sable, one of the Dark Angels' second founding successor chapters, committed its full strength to the operation. It was when the distinct signal of Cipher was detected on the planet that the campaign escalated from a significant operation into an all-consuming crusade. Person gave the order to attack, and the Forgotten Wars began in earnest. The fighting was brutal and protracted. The Unforgiven forces landed on Cocytus I and began systematically razing the dens and strongholds of the traitors they found there. Cultists, mutants, renegade marines, man, all fell before the righteous fury of the Dark Angels and their brothers. But the corruption ran deep, and the warp storms that perpetually threatened the region grew worse as the fighting intensified, as if the violence itself was feeding the dark energies that swirled around the Eye of Terror. And through it all, Cipher remained maddeningly elusive. Twice the Unforgiven forces thought they had him cornered. Twice he slipped away. And twice he sent them messages, actual communications warning them that they were heading into a trap and urging them to withdraw. Think about that for a moment. The most hunted individual in the Dark Angels' 10,000-year history was actively warning his hunters that they were in danger. He was telling them to leave, to save themselves from a disaster he could apparently see coming. The Dark Angels, of course, ignored these warnings. The hunt was everything. The secret had to be protected. Cipher had to be captured or killed, regardless of the cost. The cost, as it turned out, was staggering. Supreme Grandmaster Person eventually recognized that Cipher's warnings might have merit. The warp storms were intensifying, and the situation on the ground was deteriorating rapidly. He gave the order to retreat. Most of the Unforgiven forces began their withdrawal, fighting their way back to their ships through increasingly hostile territory. But the Lion's Sable refused to leave. Whether this was an act of stubborn defiance, a manifestation of the same unyielding determination that had characterized their Primarch Lion L. Johnson, or something else entirely, the Lion's Sable chose to stand their ground. They pressed deeper into the corrupted wasteland of Cocytus, pursuing targets that had become all but unreachable as the warp storms closed in around them. Person, moved by the Lion Sable's defiance, and perhaps recognizing in it an echo of the Lion's own unbreakable will, made the fateful decision to go back. Taking only his personal bodyguard, the Supreme Grandmaster returned to the planet's surface. He ordered the fleet to pull back from the Eye of Terror and wait for the storms to clear. He would contact them when it was safe to return. No one ever heard from Person or the Lion Sable again. The entire chapter was lost, swallowed by the warp along with the Supreme Grandmaster of the Dark Angels. It was a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. At the complete annihilation of an entire Space Marine chapter and the death of one of the highest-ranking members of the Inner Circle. But the disaster did not end there. When the storms finally subsided enough for the surviving Unforgiven to begin picking up the pieces, something strange happened. Cipher's signal appeared again, this time in the same system as the rock itself. Hunt teams were immediately scrambled, but once again, Cipher eluded them. And this time, he left something behind. In an empty cathedral to the Emperor on a ruined and desolate planet, the Unforgiven found two objects placed carefully where they could not be missed. The Sword of Secrets and the Lion Helm, the two most potent icons of the Dark Angels, the sacred regalia carried by their Supreme Grandmaster, Person's gear, what returned by the very being they had been hunting. Whether this was a trap, a test, a gesture of contempt, or some kind of twisted offering, no one could say. But the implications were staggering. Cipher had not only survived the disaster that had consumed an entire chapter and a Supreme Grand Master, he had somehow obtained the most sacred relics of the Dark Angel's leadership and chosen to give them back. It was as if he were saying, "Look at what I can do, look at what I can take and what I can return. You cannot catch me, but I can reach you whenever I choose." The aftermath of the Forgotten Wars was a masterpiece of cover-up and damage control. The Inner Circle decided that all records of the campaign and of the Lion's Sable chapter's existence would be destroyed. The recruiting world of the Lion's Sable the ebon orb of Nachwald, was transferred to other unforgiven chapters, and its connection to the destroyed chapter erased from history. The Dark Angels staged a false plasma explosion aboard the rock to explain the supposed loss of records that might have mentioned the lion's sable, adding another lie to the towering edifice of deception that constituted their official history. The surviving Marines who had fought on Cocytus were scattered among the unforgiven chapters, their identities submerged into new units where their sudden appearance would not attract attention. Each was monitored for the rest of his life by company chaplains, watching for any sign that their prolonged exposure to warp energies had left them tainted. And the Dark Angels vowed never to speak of the Forgotten Wars again. They buried the truth so deeply that by the 33rd millennium, when the great document known as the Apocrypha of Davio attempted to list all known second founding chapters, the name Lion's Sable had already been lost to history. But within the deepest dungeons of the rock, where only the members of the inner circle ever ventured, the true records were preserved. And alongside those records was a growing dossier on the figure known as Cipher, a being that the Dark Angels were beginning to realize was something far more dangerous and far more complex than just another fallen angel. The Forgotten Wars revealed several things about Cipher that would prove crucial to understanding his behavior over the coming millennia. First, he was not simply running. A fugitive who wanted nothing more than to avoid capture would not have remained in the Cocytus system after the Dark Angels arrived in force. He would not have sent warnings to his pursuers. He would not have led them into a deserted cathedral and left the Supreme Grand Master's own regalia where they could not be missed. Cipher was not running from the Dark Angels. He was engaging with them, communicating with them, testing them. Second, and more disturbingly, the Forgotten Wars demonstrated that Cipher was willing to sacrifice others for his purposes. The Lion's Sable did not have to die. If they had heeded Cipher's warnings, if they had retreated when he told them to, they might have survived. But Cipher must have known that Space Marines, especially Space Marines descended from the Lion, would not retreat from a fight. He must have known that his warnings would be ignored. And yet he sent them anyway, perhaps to establish a record that he had tried. Or perhaps because the warnings themselves were part of a larger strategy that required the Lion's Sable's destruction as an input. This is one of the most chilling aspects of Cipher's character. He is not cruel in the conventional sense. He does not inflict suffering for its own sake, but he is willing to allow suffering, even to create the conditions for it, if doing so serves whatever higher purpose drives his actions. He operates on a moral calculus that values long-term outcomes over short-term costs. And in that calculus, the deaths of an entire chapter of Space Marines might be an acceptable price for achieving an objective that only he can see. Third, the Forgotten Wars established the peculiar relationship between Cipher and the relics of the Dark Angels. By returning the Sword of Secrets and the Lion Helm, and he demonstrated that he had access to the most sacred objects of the chapter, and that he chose to return them rather than keep them or destroy them. This was not the behavior of an enemy, but neither was it the behavior of a friend. It was the behavior of something else entirely, something that existed outside the simple binary of ally and adversary, something that related to the Dark Angels not as an opponent in a war, but as a teacher in a lesson that his students did not know they were receiving. As one unnamed member of the inner circle would later observe, in words that capture perfectly the maddening nature of the Cipher enigma, "I know not why, but I believe Cipher is testing us, seeking always to take our measure, to push us beyond our boundaries. He is not simply evading capture, he is provoking us, challenging us. And I do not know whether the purpose of these tests is to make us stronger or to destroy us." It was a question that would remain unanswered for millennia to come. Part 4. A Trail of Fire and Shadow Across the Galaxy. After the Forgotten Wars, Cipher vanished from the Dark Angel's immediate awareness for a time. But the reprieve was temporary. Over the following centuries and millennia, reports began to filter back to the inner circle from across the Imperium. Sightings of a hooded figure in power armor, wearing bone-white robes over plates of deep green ceramite, a warrior who wielded twin pistols, a bolt pistol and a plasma pistol, with a marksmanship so precise that it bordered on the supernatural, a lone traveler who appeared without warning, lingered long enough to set events in motion, and then disappeared as suddenly as he had arrived, leaving chaos and confusion in his wake. Cipher had not been idle during his absence from the Dark Angel's hunting grounds. He had been busy, terrifyingly busy. The scope of Cipher's activities across the millennia is almost impossible to catalogue completely, because so much of what he does operates at the margins of recorded history. He does not announce himself. He does not seek fame or notoriety. He moves through the Imperium like a virus through a body, invisible until his effects become impossible to ignore. On some worlds, his presence manifested as subtle shifts in political power, a governor suddenly losing the confidence of his peers, a military commander making decisions that serve no apparent strategic purpose, and a trade route being disrupted in ways that benefited no obvious faction. On other worlds, the effects were more dramatic. Uprisings that erupted seemingly from nowhere, their participants driven by a fervent conviction that they could not have developed on their own. Military installations that suffered catastrophic equipment failures at precisely the worst possible moment. Loyalist forces that found themselves fighting each other due to miscommunications and false intelligence reports that could be traced to no identifiable source. Wherever Cipher appeared, destruction followed. But here is the thing that makes him so profoundly difficult to categorize, so resistant to simple judgments of good or evil. Cipher rarely instigated the violence directly. He was not, in most cases, the one pulling the trigger or giving the order. Instead, he seemed to act as a catalyst, a spark that ignited fires that were already smoldering beneath the surface. He found the fault lines in societies and institutions and applied precisely the right pressure to make them crack. He identified the dormant resentments and suppressed grievances in the populations he encountered and brought them to the surface, where they erupted into open conflict. It was as if he could see the hidden weaknesses in every system he touched, and his very presence was enough to make those weaknesses catastrophically manifest. Whether this was a deliberate strategy, a supernatural ability, or simply an inevitable consequence of the dark energies that surrounded him, was a matter of intense debate among those few members of the inner circle who were aware of his activities. Some believed that Cipher was an agent of chaos, a tool of the dark gods sent to undermine the Imperium from within. His connection to the fallen, his 10,000-year history of eluding the Dark Angels, his apparent ability to appear and disappear at will, all of these factors pointed towards some form of supernatural patronage. The Chaos Gods were known for their patience and their love of long games, and a 10,000-year campaign of subtle destabilization was exactly the kind of slow, insidious corruption they delighted in. Others, however, pointed to evidence that complicated this interpretation. Cipher had been observed fighting against chaos forces on multiple occasions. He had been seen helping Imperial civilians escape from war zones. He had killed Orc warlords who threatened Imperial worlds and eliminated Chaos champions who preyed on the faithful. On the world of Septius VII, he had instigated an uprising that, while destructive in the short term, ultimately resulted in the exposure and elimination of a chaos cult that had embedded itself in the planetary government. This pattern of behavior, this bewildering mix of apparent hostility and apparent service to the Imperium, made Cipher impossible to classify using the simple categories that the Imperial authorities preferred. He was not a loyalist, because loyalists did not spend 10,000 years running from the Dark Angels and leaving burning worlds in their wake. But he was not a traitor either, because traitors did not save Imperial lives or fight against the enemies of humanity. And Cipher was something else, something that did not fit into the neat boxes that the Imperium used to organize its understanding of the galaxy. And for an institution as rigidly hierarchical and dogmatically certain as the Imperium of Man, the existence of something that could not be classified was, in its own way, more terrifying than any conventional threat. Among the many documented incidents attributed to Cipher, a few stand out for their scale, their audacity, or the questions they raise about his ultimate purpose. There was the killing of the Orc war boss, who had slain Dark Angel's supreme, Grand Master Alakan, during a massive greenskin assault. The Dark Angels had been unable to reach the creature, their forces bogged down in a grinding urban battle that showed no sign of resolution. Then, from nowhere, Cipher appeared. He moved through the Orc lines like a phantom, his pistols speaking in a rapid, precise rhythm that cut down greenskins with an efficiency that defied belief. He reached the war boss, put a plasma bolt through its skull, and vanished before the Dark Angels could react. Why would a supposed enemy of the Dark Angels kill the creature that had slain one of their most important leaders? Was it an act of solidarity? A statement that whatever his quarrel with the chapter, he would not tolerate outsiders harming them? Or was it something more calculated, a demonstration of his capabilities designed to remind the Dark Angels of what he could do, both for them and against them? Then there was the incident on Dorimant, where Cipher was seen in the company of what appeared to be other fallen angels. He was leading a small band of armored warriors, all wearing the distinctive green of the pre-heresy Dark Angels, through the streets of a city racked by civil war. The Fallen fought alongside Imperial citizens against a chaos warband that had descended upon the planet, driving back the corrupted Marines with a ferocity that startled everyone who witnessed it. When the battle was over and the Chaos forces had been routed, Cipher and his companions disappeared, leaving behind only confused witnesses and a planet that had been saved from damnation by the very individuals who were supposed to be among the Imperium's greatest enemies. This ability to draw other Fallen to his side was one of the most troubling aspects of Cipher's activities, from the Dark Angel's perspective. Other Fallen were known to exist as isolated individuals or small groups, scattered and disorganized, living out their existence as renegades, mercenaries, or simply trying to disappear into the vast anonymity of the Imperium. But Cipher seemed to exert a gravitational pull on them, attracting the scattered sons of Caliban to his banner through means that the Dark Angels could not identify or understand. Whether this was accomplished through some form of psychic communication, through agents and intermediaries, through the warp itself, or through some other mechanism entirely, the result was the same. Wherever Cipher went, Fallen followed. They gathered around him like moths around a flame, drawn by something they could not name and could not resist. And this gathering of the Fallen was, for the Dark Angels, perhaps the most dangerous aspect of Cipher's activities. A single Fallen could be tracked, captured, and dealt with. And a growing army of them, organized and led by the most elusive individual in the galaxy, was a threat of an entirely different magnitude. The Inner Circle noted another disturbing pattern in Cipher's movements. Over the millennia, despite the seemingly random nature of his appearances across all 5 segmenti of the Imperium, there was a discernible trend. Slowly, gradually, with detours and diversions that spanned centuries, Cipher appeared to be moving in a specific direction. Toward Terra, toward the throne world, toward the seat of the Emperor of mankind, and the heart of the Imperium itself. This observation sent tremors of alarm through the highest levels of the Inner Circle. What could Cipher possibly want on Terra? If his intentions were hostile, the implications were terrifying. An agent of chaos, or one who had spent 10,000 years developing an unmatched ability to infiltrate, manipulate, and destroy, heading toward the most important and most heavily defended location in the galaxy? The thought was enough to keep Supreme Grandmasters awake during the rare hours when they were not engaged in the eternal hunt. But if his intentions were not hostile, if Cipher was headed to Terra for some other purpose, then the questions multiplied rather than diminished. What could he hope to accomplish there that he could not accomplish anywhere else? What was on Terra that called to him across the millennia, drawing him slowly but inexorably toward a destination that no fallen angel should ever be able to reach? The answer, some whispered in the deepest councils of the Inner Circle, this might have something to do with the sword he carried on his back, the weapon he had never been seen to draw, the blade that might hold the key to everything. Part 5. The Blade. He never draws. Of all the mysteries that surround Cipher, none is more tantalizing or more discussed than the sword he carries on his back. It is a weapon that has been with him for as long as anyone can remember, strapped across his shoulders in plain sight, yet never once drawn or wielded in combat. In a galaxy where warfare is constant and survival often depends on having the right weapon at the right moment, this deliberate refusal to use a perfectly good sword is by itself a statement. A declaration that this blade serves a purpose beyond mere combat, that it is not a weapon of war, but a symbol of something far more significant. Both Psyker's and Auspec's readouts have reported strange feedback emanating from the sword within its scabbard, as if it were the source of some barely veiled power. Sensors that pass over Cipher's form detect anomalous energy readings from the blade, readings that suggest a weapon of unusual provenance and considerable psychic resonance. This is not an ordinary sword. It is an artifact, something forged by hands that understood the interaction between the material world and the immaterium, imbued with power that goes beyond the merely physical. The legends that have grown up around this never-drawn weapon are numerous and varied, but they converge on a single, electrifying possibility. The sword on Cipher's back may be the Lion Sword, the personal weapon of Primarch Lionel Johnson himself. But the Lion Sword was one of the most celebrated weapons of the Great Crusade era. It was a blade of exceptional quality and power, forged for or gifted to the Primarch of the Dark Angels by the Emperor himself. During the heresy, the Lion wielded this sword in some of his most dramatic confrontations, including his legendary duel with Conrad Curzay, the Night Haunter, Primarch of the Night Lords, during the period of Imperium Secundus, when Rabaut Guilliman attempted to hold the loyal fragments of the Imperium together in the Emperor's absence. During that duel, the Lion Sword proved capable of cutting through the Night Haunter's nightmare mantle, a supernaturally resilient cloak that had resisted damage from virtually every weapon it had previously encountered. The blade was a thing of almost mythical power, all befitting the first of the Primarchs. But the Lion Sword had a troubled history. During the political tensions of Imperium Secundus, when the Lion discovered that Guilliman had violated the oath he had sworn to Sanguinius regarding the use of orbital bombardment against rebels on Macragge, an enraged Guilliman broke the Lion Sword in half. The blade was shattered by one Primarch's fury at another's perceived betrayal, a fitting metaphor for the broader fractures that were tearing the Imperium apart. The broken pieces of the sword were gathered by Deathbringer Holgin, one of the Lion's most trusted lieutenants, who vowed to have the blade reforged. And reforged it was, eventually. By the end of the heresy, the Lion once again wielded the restored weapon, using it in his final, a painful confrontation with Leman Russ of the Space Wolves in the aftermath of the Siege of Terra. But after the destruction of Caliban, the Lion Sword vanished along with the Primarch. It was not found among the ruins. It was not recovered from Luther's defeated forces. It simply disappeared, as completely and as mysteriously as the Lion himself. And then, millennia later, a hooded figure began appearing across the galaxy, carrying a sword on his back that he never drew. The theory that Cipher carries the Lion Sword is supported by several pieces of evidence. First, there is the reaction of Rabaut Guilliman when he encountered Cipher during the Terran Crusade in the late 41st millennium. Guilliman recognized the sword on Cipher's back, and his reaction was immediate and visceral. Or he refused to allow Cipher anywhere near the golden throne of the Emperor while carrying that blade. This recognition strongly implies that the sword is what the legends claim it to be, because who better to recognize the Lion Sword than the Primarch, who had broken it in half 10,000 years earlier? Second, there is the matter of the sword's reported condition. According to some accounts, the blade is broken. It is damaged, incomplete, unable to fulfill its original function. If this is true, it raises the possibility that Cipher obtained the sword at some point after Guilliman broke it, but before Holgin's reforging was complete, or that the sword was broken again during the destruction of Caliban. Some versions of the legend suggest that Cipher seeks to have the sword reforged to make it whole again. and to present it to the Emperor of mankind as an offering, an act of contrition that would earn absolution and forgiveness for himself and perhaps for all the fallen. Think about what that would mean. A member of the fallen, one of the traitors who turned against the Emperor's own son, traveling across the galaxy for 10,000 years, enduring unimaginable hardships and the relentless pursuit of the most dedicated hunters in the Imperium, all for the purpose of carrying a broken sword to the foot of the Golden Throne and asking for forgiveness. It is a narrative of breathtaking ambition and profound tragedy. If this interpretation is correct, then Cipher is not a villain or a hero in any conventional sense. He is a penitent, a pilgrim on the longest and most dangerous pilgrimage in human history, carrying the weight of 10 millennia of sin on his shoulders, along with the shattered blade that symbolizes it. But there are other interpretations, darker ones, that cannot be dismissed. Some within the inner circle believe that the lion's sword is not a token of reconciliation, but a weapon of assassination. They theorize that Cipher does not seek to present the sword to the Emperor as a gesture of repentance, but rather to use it against him. The lion's sword, forged by the Emperor's own design and imbued with power sufficient to wound a Primarch, might be one of the few weapons in existence capable of killing the master of mankind. If Cipher's true purpose is to end the Emperor's life, then his slow journey toward terror takes on a horrifying new significance. There is a counter-argument to this theory, though, and it is one that many fans find compelling. If the Emperor is a perpetual, a being with the ability to regenerate from death and return to life, then killing him might not be an act of destruction at all. It might be an act of liberation. The Emperor has been trapped on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, kept in a state of perpetual near death by the life-sustaining machinery of the throne, while his psychic power maintains the Astronomicon and holds the warp at bay. He is, in effect, imprisoned, denied the release of true death that might allow his perpetual nature to activate and restore him to full life and consciousness. If Cipher understands this, if he knows or believes that killing the Emperor would actually free him, then the act of plunging the lion's sword into the Emperor's chest would not be murder. Guess it would be salvation. It would be the ultimate act of faith, a sacrifice so terrible and so counterintuitive that only someone who had spent 10,000 years walking the knife edge between loyalty and betrayal could even conceive of it. This theory suggests that Cipher is not the Emperor's enemy, but his greatest and most misunderstood servant. That everything he has done, every world he has set ablaze, every life he has disrupted, every year he has spent fleeing and fighting and scheming, has all been in service of a single, overwhelming purpose: to reach the Emperor and set him free. It is a theory that turns everything the Dark Angels believe about Cipher completely on its head. If they are hunting him to prevent him from reaching the Emperor, and if his purpose in reaching the Emperor is to save him, yes, then the Dark Angels' hunt is not just futile, it is actively counterproductive. They are preventing the salvation of the very being they are sworn to serve. And there is the Satan phase knife to consider as well, another weapon that adds layers of complexity to Cipher's already bewildering arsenal. At some point in his long history, Cipher was seen carrying a Satan phase knife, a weapon similar to the Satan phase swords used by the Caliban Temple of Imperial Assassins. These blades are weapons of extraordinary sophistication, forged using Necron technology and capable of phasing through physical matter to strike directly at the target's vital organs. How a fallen angel came to possess such a weapon is a mystery in itself. The Satan phase knife was apparently lost during a battle with the Satan known as the Deceiver, the Necron star god of trickery and manipulation, during the opening stages of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade. But the battle took place partially in the warp, and the accounts suggest that it was subject to some kind of temporal distortion, a loop in either the time continuum or reality itself. The knife has not been seen since, but its very existence raises questions about the nature of Cipher's connections and the scope of his activities. He is not merely operating within the narrow world of Dark Angels politics and the hunt for the fallen. He is engaged with forces and entities that operate on a cosmic scale, entities that manipulate time and reality itself. The sword, the knife, the twin pistols, each of Cypher's weapons tells a story, and each story leads to more questions. But it is the sword, always the sword, yet that captures the imagination most powerfully. It hangs on his back like a promise or a threat, a constant reminder that Cypher's ultimate purpose, whatever it may be, remains unfulfilled. He has carried it for 10,000 years. He has never drawn it, and the day he finally does, the galaxy will change forever. Whether that change will be for better or worse, no one can say. And that uncertainty, that knife-edge balance between hope and despair, is the very essence of the Cipher mystery. Part 6. The Tulture Gambit, attempting to rewrite the past. For all his elusiveness, for all the centuries he spent as a ghost on the galactic stage, there came a time when Cipher chose to step out of the shadows. Not because he was forced to, not because his hand was played, but because he had a plan. As a scheme so audacious and so breathtaking in its scope that it threatened to unravel the very fabric of history itself. To understand what Cipher did, you first have to understand the Tulture engine. Deep within the rock, buried in vaults that even most members of the inner circle did not know existed, there was a device. It was not human technology. It was not Xenos technology, at least not from any Xenos species the Imperium had catalogued. It was something far older and far stranger, something that predated humanity by eons. The Tulture engine was a sentient construct, possibly a warp entity, an artifact of the Old Ones, those ancient beings who had shaped the galaxy in an age so remote that even the Eldar considered it mythical. Tulture was one of 3 related entities. The others were the Ouroboros, a nightmarish entity of planetary scale that had been buried in the heart of Caliban itself, and the Plague Heart, a vast living construction that had fallen into the hands of Typhus, the herald of Nurgle and champion of the Death Guard. These 3 entities, when brought together, possessed a power that defied comprehension. They could create a rift that bridged not just space, but time. They could punch a hole through the fabric of reality and connect the present to the past, opening a doorway through which individuals could travel between eras as easily as walking through a doorway between rooms. The Tulture had been discovered by Lionel Johnson himself during the Horus Heresy in the Perditus system. The Lion had recognized the device's potential and kept it aboard his flagship, as using its ability to make extraordinarily precise warp jumps to maneuver his forces with an agility that would otherwise have been impossible. After the destruction of Caliban, Tulture had ended up embedded within the rock, where it had remained hidden for 10,000 years, guarded by the Watchers in the dark, and known only to a vanishingly small number of individuals within the chapter's leadership. Cipher knew about Tulture. He knew where it was, what it could do, and who else was trying to find it. And he knew that if the wrong people got their hands on the 3 entities and brought them together, the consequences would be catastrophic. In a move that shocked the entire inner circle, Cipher tracked down a Ravenwing squad, killed an enemy fallen who was accompanying them, and then willingly threw down his pistols and surrendered. Yet he demanded an audience with the inner circle, and what he told them was enough to shake the foundations of everything they believed. Cipher revealed that 2 other parties were actively seeking the Tulture and its brother entities. One was Maria Astalan, one of the original Dark Angels from Terra, a fallen who harbored his own delusions about rewriting history. The other was Typhus, herald of Nurgle, who possessed the Plague Heart and was seeking to combine the 3 devices in order to transport the fallen from 10,000 years in the past to the present day. Typhus planned to merge these ancient warriors with his own Death Guard forces and captured Geneseed to create a new legion, a grotesque hybrid that he called the Death Angels. The horror of this proposition is difficult to overstate. Tens of thousands of fallen are ripped from the past at the moment of Caliban's destruction and deposited in the present day, combined with the pestilent might of the Death Guard and augmented with stolen genetic material. Such a force would have represented a threat to the stability of the entire Imperium. Cipher told the Dark Angels that he could help them prevent this. He could guide them to the Tulture, help them gather the three devices before the enemy could, and use them not for Typhus's purposes, but to close the door permanently, to seal the time rift, and ensure that history remained intact. The inner circle was, understandably, skeptical. This was Cipher, the most wanted individual in their 10,000-year history, the figure who had eluded them across every segmentum, yet the ghost who had cost them an entire chapter and a supreme Grand Master during the Forgotten Wars. Trusting him was anathema to everything they had been taught. But then, the Watchers in the Dark intervened. Those mysterious, ancient entities who had been associated with Caliban and the Dark Angels since before the heresy, demonstrated behaviors that the Marines had never seen before. They showed clear signs of supporting Cipher's mission, offering their endorsement in ways that even the most skeptical members of the inner circle could not ignore. The Watchers, whatever they were, whatever agenda they served, wanted the Dark Angels to work with Cipher. And given that the Watchers were among the few entities in the galaxy that the Dark Angels trusted completely, their support carried enormous weight. Its supreme Grand Master, Azrael, made the decision. He would work with Cipher. He would trust the most untrustworthy being in the galaxy, because the alternative, allowing Typhus and the renegade Fallen to succeed, was too terrible to contemplate. The Dark Angels mobilized their full strength. The entirety of the chapter, led by the Rock itself, moved to the ruins of the Caliban system. The plague fleet of Typhus, supported by traitor vessels and the forces of the renegade Fallen, was already there when they arrived. What followed was a battle of enormous scale and ferocity, as the Dark Angels fought to prevent the traitors from activating the combined power of the three entities. The traitors succeeded in opening the warp breach first. A rift tore open above the ruins of Caliban, and through it, the Unforgiven could see back through time to the very moment of their homeworld's destruction. The temptation was almost overwhelming. Here, laid out before them, was the opportunity to change everything, to prevent Luther's betrayal, to save Caliban, to undo 10,000 years of shame and secrecy and suffering. But Ezekiel, the Grand Master of Librarians, argued passionately against attempting to rewrite history. The consequences were unpredictable, he warned. Changing the past might not save the future, it might destroy it entirely. And the fallen forces that were converging on the rift clearly intended to use it for their own purposes, purposes that could only bring ruin. Azrael listened, and he made what may have been one of the most agonizing decisions in the chapter's history. He ordered Tulture to scatter all those near the time portal, to close the rift and disperse everyone in its vicinity. Tulture obeyed. The rift collapsed, and the forces gathered around it were flung outward in all directions. But Azrael had not been specific about which moment in time he was referring to. And Tulture, being what it was, perhaps more literal-minded than any human commander would expect, interpreted the order broadly. The scattering effect reached not only those in the present, but also those 10,000 years in the past. The fallen on Caliban, the traitors who had stood against the Lion in that final, world-ending battle, were scattered by the same force. The implications of this are staggering. If Azrael's command was the cause of the scattering of the fallen during the original destruction of Caliban, then the Dark Angel's most shameful secret, the existence of the fallen scattered across time and space, was not caused by the Chaos Gods at all. It was caused by the Dark Angels themselves, reaching back through time from the 41st millennium and creating the very catastrophe that they had spent 10,000 years trying to clean up. A causal loop, a paradox of almost incomprehensible scope. The hunters created the prey. The searchers created the thing they were searching for. The past and the future folded in on each other, and the snake swallowed its own tail. And Cipher. Cipher escaped into the time rift before it collapsed. He slipped away, as he always did, leaving the Dark Angels to wrestle with the reality of what had just happened. Had he planned this? Had he known from the beginning that the rift would be destroyed and that its destruction would create the very time loop that had scattered the Fallen in the first place? Was this his purpose all along, to ensure that the cycle continued, that the Fallen existed, that the Dark Angels would be forever locked in their eternal hunt? Or was he as surprised as everyone else, simply doing what he always did, exploiting the chaos of the moment to survive and escape, leaving others to deal with the consequences while he moved on to the next phase of whatever inscrutable plan governed his existence? No one knows. No one will ever know, because Cipher left no explanations, no messages, no clues. He simply vanished, as he always vanished, all leaving nothing behind but questions and the lingering suspicion that everything that had happened exactly the way he intended. The Dark Angels, for their part, were left to count their dead. A third of the chapter had been killed or wounded in the battle, a devastating toll that would take generations to recover from. An unforgiven fleet from the Angels of Absolution, the Repentant Brotherhood, the Angels of Redemption, and the Angels of Vengeance arrived to scatter the remnants of the Chaos Armada, and a raven-winged Black Knight named Anael sacrificed his life to close the warp breach for good. It was a victory of sorts. The traitor's plan had been foiled. The Death Angels would never be created. History had not been rewritten, at least not in the way Typhus and Astalon had intended. But the price had been enormous, and the questions that the battle raised were perhaps more destabilizing than any military defeat could have been. The Dark Angels had stared into the void of their own history and found at the bottom not the Chaos Gods or the treachery of Luther, but themselves. Their own actions, their own decisions, echoing backward through time to create the very tragedy that defined them. For a chapter that had built its entire identity around the pursuit of the Fallen and the protection of their dark secret, this was a revelation that threatened to undermine everything they believed about themselves and their mission. And somewhere in the shadows between the stars, a hooded figure moved on, carrying a sword he never drew and secrets he never spoke, heading always, always toward terror. That's part 7, the Terran Crusade, walking beside a Primarch. The next time Cipher emerged from the shadows, the galaxy itself was breaking apart. The 13th Black Crusade, the greatest assault on the Imperium since the Horus Heresy itself, had reached its devastating climax. Abaddon the Despoiler, War Master of Chaos, had finally achieved what 12 previous attempts had failed to accomplish. The fortress world of Cadia had fallen. The great pylons that had held the Eye of Terror in check for millennia were destroyed, and without their stabilizing influence, the warp erupted across the galaxy in an unprecedented cataclysm. The Great Rift, also called the Cicatrix Maledictum, tore reality in half. A wound in the fabric of space itself, stretching from the Eye of Terror in the galactic northwest to the eastern fringe, in splitting the Imperium into two unequal halves. On one side, Terra and the more densely populated core worlds, still barely connected to one another by the faltering light of the Astronomicon. On the other side, the Dark Imperium, Imperium Nihilus, the half of humanity's domain that had been cut off from the Emperor's light, plunged into darkness and besieged on all sides by the enemies that darkness breeds. It was a catastrophe of galactic proportions, the worst thing that had happened to the Imperium in 10,000 years. And in the midst of it, something extraordinary occurred. Robute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, was resurrected. The Lord of Ultramar had been mortally wounded during the Battle of Thessala in the 31st Millennium, poisoned by the blade of Fulgrim, as the traitorous Primarch of the Emperor's children. For 10 millennia, he had lain in stasis within the shrine of the Primarch on Macraga, his body preserved, but his life hanging by the thinnest of threads. Now, through the combined efforts of Archmagos Belisarius Call, of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the elder deity Iniad's emissary Ivrain, Guilliman was brought back from the edge of death, but his resurrection was immediately met with crisis. The forces of chaos descended upon Macragge, and Guilliman found himself fighting for his life before he had even had time to process the fact that he was alive again. He rallied the defenders, fought off the initial assault, and then set about the urgent task of reaching Terra. The Imperium was in chaos, its leadership fractured and ineffective, and only the authority of a Primarch could hope to restore order. The journey to Terra was not simple. The Great Rift had disrupted warp travel across the galaxy, making the usual routes dangerous or impassable. Guilliman's force, which came to be known as the Terran Crusade, had to fight its way across the stars, dealing with chaos forces, warp storms, and the general collapse of order that the Great Rift had caused. At one of the lowest points of this journey, the Crusade found itself trapped. The Primarch and his forces had been captured by the Red Corsairs, a powerful pirate warband led by the infamous Huron Blackheart. Imprisoned aboard a Blackstone fortress, with his forces scattered and his options dwindling, our Guilliman faced the very real possibility that his resurrection would end not in the salvation of the Imperium, but in an ignoble death at the hands of a glorified pirate lord. And that is when Cipher appeared. He materialized alongside the Harlequin Silandri Veilwalker, one of the mysterious Eldar performers who served the laughing god Segarak. Together, they penetrated the Red Corsair's defenses, killed the guard watching over Guilliman, and presented the captive Primarch with an offer he could not refuse. Cipher would free Guilliman. He would guide the Primarch and his forces to safety through a webway portal that Veilwalker would open. He would provide assistance for the remainder of the journey to Terra. In exchange, Guilliman would bring Cipher to Terra and grant him access to the Golden Throne. The terms were simple, but their implications were enormous. Cipher, the most wanted fallen angel in the galaxy, the figure who had been hunted by the Dark Angels for 10,000 years, was asking to be taken to the one place in the Imperium that no fallen should ever be able to reach, the throne room of the Emperor of Mankind. Guilliman agreed. He had little choice. The alternative was death or continued imprisonment, and the Imperium could not afford to lose its only active Primarch. Whatever Cipher's ulterior motives, the immediate priority was survival and the completion of the Crusade. The escape from the Red Corsairs was dramatic and violent. Cipher and his growing band of fallen, warriors who had materialized seemingly from nowhere to join him in the webway, he fought alongside the Ultramarines and their allies with a skill and ferocity that surprised even the veteran Space Marines. Whatever else could be said about the fallen, they were still Dark Angels at their core, still warriors of the First Legion, and their prowess in battle was undeniable. The Crusade fought its way through the webway, emerging into real space near Luna, the moon of Terra. There, they encountered a massive chaos force led by Magnus the Red, the demon Primarch of the Thousand Suns, who had his own designs on the throne world. A savage battle erupted on the lunar surface, and Cipher fought in it alongside Guilliman and his forces, adding his pistols and his tactical acumen to the defense of the approach to Terra. It was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable sequences of events in the history of the Imperium. One, a fallen angel, a supposed traitor to the Emperor, fighting side by side with a Primarch to defend the approach to humanity's most sacred world. The irony was almost too thick to bear, and it raised questions that neither the Dark Angels nor anyone else could easily answer. When the battle was won and the Crusade finally reached Terra, the moment of reckoning arrived. Guilliman and his entourage approached the Golden Throne, the destination of their long and bloody journey. And there, at the threshold of the Emperor's sanctum, the Primarch made a decision that Cipher clearly had not anticipated. He ordered the Adeptus Custodes to arrest Cipher and his fallen companions. Guilliman had recognized the sword on Cipher's back. Whatever deal he had made in the desperate circumstances of their escape, whatever promises had been exchanged in the heat of battle, the Primarch had no intention of allowing a fallen angel carrying the lion sword anywhere near the Emperor. The risk was too great, the uncertainty too profound. When the custodians moved to take him into custody, Cipher reacted with a flash of anger. He unholstered his weapons, his hands moving with the blinding speed that had made him legendary, and for one terrible heartbeat, it seemed as though he might resist. But then, he lowered his pistols and submitted. He and his fallen companions were taken into the custody of the Adeptus Custodes and led away to the Dark Cells, the most secure prison in the entire Imperium, a facility specifically designed to contain the most dangerous individuals in the galaxy, from which no prisoner had ever escaped. Oh, there is a detail here that is easy to miss, but profoundly important. As Cipher was led away, witnesses reported that he showed no surprise at Guilliman's betrayal. He was angry, yes. He was frustrated, but he was not surprised. It was as if he had expected this outcome, as if being imprisoned in the Dark Cells was not a deviation from his plan, but a part of it. And as he was taken into the depths of the most secure prison ever built by human hands, Cipher was reportedly heard to express confidence that he would escape. From a prison that no one had ever escaped from. The sheer audacity of this confidence would have been laughable if the speaker had been anyone else. But this was Cipher, and if 10,000 years of history had proven anything, it was that Cipher did not make idle boasts. Part 8. The Dark Cells. Escape from the inescapable. The Dark Cells of the Adeptus. Custodes are, by design, the most secure confinement facility in the known galaxy. Located deep beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, they are warded with psychic protections of extraordinary potency, guarded by the most elite warriors humanity has ever produced, and designed with the specific intention of ensuring that whatever goes into them stays in them. The Dark Cells have held demonic entities, rogue psychers of world-ending power, and specimens of alien horror that defy classification. No prisoner, in the entire history of the facility, had ever succeeded in escaping, until Cipher. What happened in the Dark Cells during the period following Cipher's imprisonment has been documented in the novel Cipher, Lord of the Fallen by John French. Yes, and it reads like a masterclass in strategic manipulation on a scale that borders on the supernatural. As the Great Rift tore across the skies of Terra, destabilizing the warp and throwing the planet into chaos, a series of seemingly unconnected events began to unfold within and around the Imperial Palace. A small strike force of Dark Angels, led by a warrior named Mordachi, infiltrated the palace. They had come for Cipher, not to free him, but to capture or kill him, because the Dark Angels' obsession with their own secret transcended even basic common sense. In their determination to prevent anyone from extracting information about the Fallen from their most dangerous brother, Mordachi and his Marines fought their way through the palace's defenses, damaging the security systems and killing Imperial personnel along the way. Think about that for a moment. The Dark Angels, who proclaimed themselves loyal servants of the Emperor, infiltrated his own palace and murdered his own defenders, all because they were more afraid of their secret being exposed than they were of committing treason against the throne world itself. It is one of the most damning indictments of the Dark Angels' obsession with secrecy that the law has ever produced, and it illustrates perfectly the insane lengths to which they will go to maintain their facade of purity. But here is the truly maddening part. The Dark Angels' infiltration was not an obstacle to Cipher's escape. It was part of it. The damage they caused to the palace's defenses, the confusion they sowed among the Custodes and the other security forces, the diversion they created with their presence. All of it contributed to the conditions that allowed Cipher to break free. It is as if Cipher had predicted that the Dark Angels would come for him, as if he had counted on their obsession, their inability to leave well enough alone, their pathological need to control every piece of information about the Fallen. He had used their greatest weakness, the very trait that defined their chapter identity, as a tool for his own liberation. But the Dark Angels were not the only ones drawn into Cipher's web. Imperial assassins were deployed to contain the situation, their lethal skills directed against both the Dark Angels' intruders and the escaped prisoners. The Adeptus Custodes mobilized their own forces, including a warden named Hecaron, who proved to be perhaps the most perceptive and dangerous of Cipher's pursuers. What emerged from the chaos was a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the forgotten corridors and hidden passages of the imperial palace. Cipher, accompanied by a small group of fallen who had escaped with him, moved through the palace with an uncanny knowledge of its layout. He seemed to know things he should not have known, predicted events that had not yet occurred, and exploited vulnerabilities that had been decades or centuries in the making. The novel's narrator, who speaks with Cipher's own voice, provides tantalizing glimpses into the Lord of the Fallen's thought processes. He knows the history of the palace's construction. He knows the weaknesses in its defenses, weaknesses that trace their origins back generations. As to decisions made by architects and administrators who could never have imagined that their choices would one day be exploited by an escaping prisoner. It is this quality, this seemingly prescient awareness of how events will unfold, that sets Cipher apart from any ordinary fugitive. He does not simply react to circumstances. He shapes them. He sees the threads of causality stretching out before him and pulls on exactly the right ones, at exactly the right moments, to produce the outcomes he desires. Whether this is the result of supernatural foresight, extraordinary intelligence, detailed advanced preparation, or some combination of all three, is never made entirely clear. During his escape, Cipher did something that reveals his true purpose more clearly than almost any other action in his 10,000-year history. Yet he did not head for an exit. He did not try to flee the palace. Instead, he headed deeper into it, toward the throne room, toward the Emperor. He revealed to his companions that his intention was not to escape terror, but to reach the Sanctum Imperialis, the innermost chamber of the imperial palace where the golden throne sat, where the Emperor of mankind clung to his tortured half-existence. This had been Cipher's goal all along, the destination of his 10,000-year pilgrimage, the place where whatever purpose had driven him across the galaxy would finally be fulfilled. Using a forgotten doorway to the Sanctum Imperialis called the Path of Martyrs, Cipher and his group fought their way past pursuing dark angels and assassins, making their way deeper and deeper into the most sacred and most heavily protected structure in the galaxy. Thus, the tension of this sequence is extraordinary, because for the first time in 10,000 years of lore, Cipher was on the verge of actually reaching his destination. After all the running, all the fighting, all the scheming and suffering, he was steps away from the Golden Throne. He reached the Bridge of Ascension, the final approach to the throne room, and there, standing between him and his goal, was a single figure. Custodian Warden Hecaron. Hecaron was badly wounded from the running battles throughout the palace. He had been tracking Cipher from the beginning, and of all the warriors who had pursued the Lord of the Fallen through the labyrinthine depths of the palace, he had come closest to understanding the nature of his quarry. Hecaron stood in Cipher's path, battered and bleeding but unbowed, but the last barrier between a 10,000-year pilgrimage and its completion. And then something happened that no one had anticipated, least of all, Cipher himself. Hecaron received a psychic vision. It came from an unnamed source, though the implication is overwhelming that it originated from the Emperor himself. The vision carried a simple message, two words that echoed through Hecaron's mind with a clarity and authority that transcended anything he had ever experienced. Not yet. Hecaron spoke the words aloud, delivering the message to Cipher. And for what may have been the first time in his entire existence as the Lord of the Fallen, Cipher was genuinely surprised. Everything else that had happened during his escape, the Dark Angel's infiltration, the assassin's deployment, the custode's pursuit, well, all of it had gone according to his calculations. He had predicted every move, anticipated every response, manipulated every variable. But this, a direct message from the Emperor, was something he had not foreseen. Not yet, not never, not you will not pass, not you are unworthy, or you are my enemy. Just two simple, devastating words, not yet. Think about what those words mean. They mean that the Emperor is aware of Cipher, that he knows what Cipher is carrying and what he intends to do with it, that he has an opinion on the matter, and that opinion is not outright rejection. The Emperor is telling Cipher to wait. to be patient. The time is not right, but the implication is that there will be a time when it is right. Someday, eventually, the Emperor will be ready for whatever Cipher brings. The effect on Cipher was profound. Oh, for a long moment, the Lord of the Fallen stood on the Bridge of Ascension, staring at the wounded custodian and the message he carried. And then, grudgingly, reluctantly, with a frustration that 10,000 years of patience could not fully conceal, Cipher accepted the message. He turned around. He walked away from the Golden Throne. And he somehow managed to escape terror entirely, vanishing once again into the galaxy, carrying the sword that was not yet meant to be delivered, heading back into the shadows that had been his home for longer than most civilizations had existed. After his escape, the pursuit continued. The Dark Angels, predictably, launched a renewed hunt that led to the massacre at Dark Moor, and a catastrophic engagement on a shrine world, where elements of half a dozen unforgiven chapters descended in pursuit of newly materialized Fallen. Instead of finding easy prey, they discovered that they had walked into a trap. The hunters became the hunted, and the unforgiven suffered devastating losses. More significantly, the Adeptus Custodes also joined the hunt. A combined force of custodians and Sisters of Silence, under the command of Shield Captain Dareth, was dispatched to pursue and recapture Cipher. This is an escalation of almost unprecedented proportions. The Emperor's own personal bodyguard, the most elite warriors in the Imperium, diverted from their sacred duty of protecting the throne world to chase a single fallen angel across the galaxy. Whilst the mere fact that such resources were committed to Cipher's recapture speaks volumes about how seriously the highest authorities of the Imperium take the threat, or the promise, that he represents. And yet, despite everything, despite the Dark Angels and the Custodes and the Assassins and every other force that has been directed against him, Cipher remains free. He walks the galaxy still, a hooded figure in bone-white robes, carrying his twin pistols and the sword he never draws, attended by the Fallen, who gather around him like pilgrims around a prophet, heading always toward a destination that was denied to him, but not forever. Not yet. Part 9. Who is he really? The identity behind the hood. We have traveled far together now, through 10,000 years of history, and across the ruins of a shattered world, and the corridors of the most sacred building in the galaxy. We have followed Cipher from the forests of Caliban to the foot of the Golden Throne and back again, watched him elude the most determined hunters in the Imperium, and manipulate events on a scale that defies comprehension. But the question that has haunted this entire narrative remains unanswered. Who is Cipher? Not what does he want, or where is he going, or what will he do when he gets there? Those are important questions, and we will address them. But the more fundamental question, the one that has driven the community to decades of speculation and debate, is simpler and more profound. Who is the man beneath the hood? There are several candidates, each with their own body of evidence and each with their own set of compelling arguments. But let us examine them one by one. The first and perhaps most obvious candidate is Zahariel El-Zurias, the Dark Angel's librarian who was elevated to the position of Lord Cipher by Luther himself during the early stages of the rebellion on Caliban. The case for Zahariel rests on several pillars. First, he actually held the title. He was formally made Lord Cipher, which gives him a direct and documented connection to the name. Second, he was one of only 4 people who knew the Starfire code word, the activation code for the orbital defense weapons that fired on the Lion's fleet. When the modern Cipher used this code word during one of his rare periods of captivity, it dramatically narrowed the field of possible identities. Third, Zahariel was a powerful psyker, a librarian of considerable ability, which could explain Cipher's seemingly supernatural capacity for prediction and manipulation. Fourth, Zahariel was a fallen angel, which is consistent with the established law that the modern Cipher is one of the fallen. But there are arguments against Zahariel as well. During the Horus Heresy, Zahariel did not get along with the Watchers in the dark. He had a tense and often adversarial relationship with these mysterious beings. The modern Cipher, by contrast, appears to enjoy the Watcher's support and cooperation. This discrepancy is significant because the Watchers are clearly important allies of whoever the modern Cipher turns out to be. Additionally, when Cipher surrendered to the Dark Angels during the Tulture affair, his behavior was described as lacking malice. He seemed almost benevolent, as cooperative in a way that does not match the profile of a man who had joined a rebellion against the Imperium and dabbled in sorcery. And previous Supreme Grand Masters reportedly captured Cipher on multiple occasions and let him go, which would be an inexplicable decision if they believed he was Zahariel, a known traitor. There is also the possibility that Zahariel went on to become someone else entirely. Some lore sources hint that Zahariel may have been Epimetheus, one of the founding Grand Masters of the Grey Knights, the elite demon-hunting chapter created by Malcador the Sigillite. If this is true, then Zahariel was siphoned off to serve a different purpose entirely, and the modern Cipher must be someone else. The second candidate is Corswain, the Hound of Caliban, one of the Lion's most trusted lieutenants and the commander of a significant portion of the Dark Angels' fleet during the heresy. Corswain was a legendary warrior, famous for his swordsmanship and his unwavering loyalty to the Lion. During the fall of Caliban, Corswain's last known position was in orbit, commanding a fleet action against the traitor forces. He is not documented as having died at Caliban, but neither is he documented as having survived. The case for Corswain is largely circumstantial, but compelling. He was personally familiar with the Lion, which is relevant because during one of his conversations with the Dark Angels, Cipher told Azrael that he would have made a good seneschal for the Lion, using a term that specifically referred to a role that Corzin himself had been groomed for. This implies that whoever Cipher is, he knew the Lion personally and was familiar with the internal dynamics of the Legion's highest leadership. Furthermore, Corswain had direct knowledge of the Tulture engine and Typhus's involvement with warp devices, which would explain how Cipher knew about these things in the 41st Millennium. And as one of the Lion's most loyal sons, Corswain would be an odd choice for a traitor, but a perfect choice for someone who had been operating in the shadows for 10,000 years, pursuing a mission of redemption that required him to appear as a traitor while actually serving a higher purpose. The third candidate is Farith Redloss, the first captain of the Dark Angels' Dreadwing and the captain of the Lion's Honor Guard. Redloss was a native of Caliban who had been rescued from the great beasts as a child and grew up to become one of the most formidable warriors in the Legion. As commander of the Dreadwing, the Legion's most devastating specialized formation, Redloss was a figure of terrifying capability and absolute dedication to the Lion's cause. The case for Redloss gained traction when rumors circulated that Games Workshop was planning to reveal Cipher's identity as Redloss during the Gathering Storm campaign. This never happened definitively, but the rumor persisted because it made a certain kind of sense. As the commander of the Lion's Honor Guard, Redloss would have been in a position to obtain the Lion Sword during the chaos of Caliban's destruction. And as a warrior who had spent his career commanding the most destructive forces in the Legion, he would have the skills and the ruthlessness needed to survive 10,000 years as the galaxy's most wanted fugitive. But here is the uncomfortable truth that underlies all of these theories. Games Workshop has deliberately and explicitly refused to confirm any of them. The identity of Cipher remains one of the company's most carefully guarded creative secrets, and there is a school of thought that argues the question should never be answered. That the mystery is the point, that Cipher's power as a character derives precisely from the fact that we do not know who he is, and that any definitive answer would diminish him. The author Gav Thorpe, who has written extensively about the Dark Angels and Cipher, has said that the tale of Cipher can be pieced together even if there is never going to be a definitive answer. This suggests that the clues are there for careful readers to follow, but that the puzzle is designed to be tantalizingly close to completion, without ever being fully solved. And perhaps that is as it should be, because Cipher is not really about the man beneath the hood. He is about the concept that the hood represents. He is the embodiment of ambiguity in a setting that usually deals in absolutes. In a universe where every faction and every character can usually be slotted neatly into the categories of loyal or traitor, good or evil, imperial or heretical, Cipher defies classification. He is the grey in a world of black and white, the question mark in a universe of exclamation points. And that, perhaps more than any specific identity, is what makes him the most mysterious character in Warhammer 40,000. Part 10. The Lion Returns, a collision of destinies. In the era Indomitus, something happened that added an entirely new dimension to the Cipher mystery. Something that transformed the stakes from merely galactic to almost mythological in their scope. Lion L. Johnson woke up. The Primarch of the Dark Angels, the first of the Emperor's sons, the warrior who had slept in a hidden chamber deep within the rock for 10,000 years while his wounds healed, was roused from his slumber during the Arcs of Omen campaign. The specifics of his awakening involve Vashtor the Archifane, a demon prince of chaos who sought to combine the three warp entities, including the Tulture engine, to create a cosmic key that would unlock an Old One's weapon of unimaginable power. During the assault on the rock, the Watchers in the Dark decided that the time had come. They woke the lion, and the lion, with the abruptness and directness that had characterized him even before 10 millennia of sleep, immediately set about doing what he did best: fighting, leading, destroying the enemies of humanity with a fury and a tactical brilliance that had not been seen since the days of the Great Crusade. But the lion's return raised questions that go straight to the heart of the Cipher mystery, because the lion is now awake and he is no longer wielding the lion sword. The lion sword, if the lore is correct, is still in Cipher's possession. The Primarch has returned to the galaxy armed with a different weapon, the blade called Fealty, and protected by the Emperor's shield. He does not have his legendary sword, the weapon that was forged for him by his father, the blade that he carried through the greatest battles of the Great Crusade and the Heresy. That sword is on Cipher's back, and the lion knows about the Fallen. He knows about the Dark Angels' 10,000-year obsession with hunting them down. He knows about the secret that has defined his legion and its successors since the destruction of Caliban. But his perspective on the Fallen is not necessarily the same as Azrael's or any other supreme Grand Masters. The lion was there when Caliban fell. He was the one who fought Luther. He was the one who was struck down by his own mentor and best friend. His understanding of what happened and why it happened is personal in a way that no subsequent chapter master could ever match. The implications for Cipher are enormous. For 10,000 years, Cipher has been hunted by the Dark Angels. For 10,000 years he has been classified as one of the Fallen, a traitor, an enemy to be captured or killed. But now the Primarch himself is back, and the Primarch has the authority to redefine everything. He could pardon the Fallen. He could reveal the truth about Caliban. He could end the hunt that has consumed his sons for 10 millennia. Or he could do something else entirely. The lion was always the most secretive and the most pragmatic of the Primarchs. He might see value in maintaining the hunt, in keeping the Dark Angels focused and motivated by their shame. He might view Cipher not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a tool to be used, an agent operating in the shadows to accomplish things that the Primarch himself cannot do openly. There is also the matter of the lion sword itself. And if Cipher truly carries the Primarch's personal weapon, then at some point, the two of them will have to come face to face. The Primarch will want his sword back, and Cipher will have to decide whether to hand it over or whether the sword's purpose transcends even the wishes of the Primarch who once wielded it. Imagine that meeting. 10,000 years of mystery and pursuit distilled into a single moment. The lion, the greatest warrior the Dark Angels have ever known, standing face to face with the hooded figure who has haunted his son's nightmares for 100 centuries. What would they say to each other? What truths would be revealed? What secrets would finally be laid bare? Would Cipher kneel before his Primarch and offer the sword in a gesture of submission and repentance? Would the lion accept it? And with that acceptance, us grant the absolution that Cipher has supposedly been seeking for 10,000 years? Or would Cipher refuse? Would he tell the lion that the sword is not for him, that its destination is the Golden Throne, that the Emperor himself told him not yet, and that he will wait until the time is right, no matter what anyone, even a Primarch, demands of him? The tension between these possibilities is what makes the current era of Warhammer 40,000 lore so fascinating for anyone who follows the Cipher story. All the pieces are in play. The Primarch is awake. The sword is still in Cipher's hands. The Emperor has communicated, however briefly and cryptically, that he has a plan for whatever Cipher is carrying. And the galaxy is in more danger than it has been at any point since the heresy itself. Which means that whatever purpose Cipher's pilgrimage serves, it has never been more relevant or more urgent. Luther, too, is free. The arch-betrayer was liberated from his prison beneath the rock during a demon assault led by the fallen demon Prince Marbus. His escape was apparently deliberate, a planned operation disguised as a random act of demonic violence. Luther is now out in the galaxy, and there are reports that he is assembling the fallen into a force that could rival a legion. This creates a three-sided dynamic that has never existed before in the Cipher narrative. On one side, the Lion, returned Primarch, Lord of the Dark Angels, seeking to reclaim his legion's honor and lead them into a new era. On another side, Luther, the arch-betrayer, freed from his prison and gathering the fallen to his banner, possibly seeking redemption, possibly seeking revenge, possibly pursuing an agenda that only a man driven mad by 10,000 years of imprisonment could conceive. And between them, Cipher, the figure who answers to neither, who serves only the purpose he has chosen for himself, carrying a sword that belongs to one and bearing a legacy that connects him to the other, walking his own path through the gathering storm. Whatever happens next, it will be the culmination of a story that has been building for 10,000 years, both in the fiction and in the real world. Cipher was first introduced to the Warhammer 40,000 setting decades ago, and in all that time, his mystery has only deepened. He is one of those rare fictional characters who becomes more compelling the more you learn about him, whilst because every answer only reveals how much more there is to discover. Part 11. Theories and meaning. What does it all add up to? We have covered a vast amount of ground together. We have traced the origins of the Lord Cipher title back to the knightly orders of pre-imperial Caliban. We have watched the fall of a world and the scattering of an army across time and space. We have followed a hooded figure through 10,000 years of galactic war, watched him elude the most determined hunters in the Imperium, manipulate events on a cosmic scale, fight alongside a Primarch, escape from the most secure prison ever built, and stand within steps of the Emperor's golden throne before being turned away by a message from the Master of mankind himself. Now let us try to make sense of it all. There are, broadly speaking, three major theories about what Cipher is ultimately trying to accomplish. The first theory is that Cipher is genuinely seeking redemption for himself and the fallen. In this interpretation, his 10,000-year journey is a pilgrimage, the longest and most painful act of contrition in human history. He carries the lion sword because he intends to present it to the Emperor as an offering, a symbol of repentance, and a request for forgiveness. He fights against chaos because his loyalty to the Emperor is real, even if the Dark Angels refuse to believe it. He evades capture not because he is guilty, but because the Dark Angels' obsession with secrecy would lead them to kill him before he can complete his mission, and his mission is more important than their peace of mind. In this reading, Cipher is a tragic hero, as a man who has sacrificed everything: his name, his identity, his freedom, his reputation, in service of a goal that no one else can see or understand. He has endured 10 millennia of pursuit and persecution, fighting and running and hiding and scheming, all because he believes that the sword he carries holds the key to healing the wound that has festered at the heart of the Imperium since the heresy. The "not yet" from the Emperor supports this theory. If the Emperor regarded Cipher as a genuine threat, if the sword was a weapon meant for assassination rather than a gift meant for reconciliation, why would the Emperor's message be "not yet" rather than "never"? The implication is that the Emperor acknowledges Cipher's purpose and even approves of it. He simply judges that the time is not yet right for its fulfillment. The second theory is that Cipher is an agent of chaos, consciously or unconsciously working to bring about the Emperor's destruction. In this darker interpretation, the Lion Sword is indeed an assassination weapon, and Cipher's goal is to use it to strike down the master of mankind. His apparent acts of loyalty and his fights against chaos forces are either misdirection, designed to lower the Imperium's guard, or evidence that even chaos agents sometimes find it necessary to eliminate their competition. This theory has its own supporting evidence. Cipher's presence invariably brings destruction, even when he is not directly responsible for it. The worlds he visits burn. The institutions he touches collapse. The people who interact with him are left broken and confused. If he were truly a force for redemption, his advocates argue, where his passage through the galaxy would not leave such a trail of devastation. Furthermore, the Chaos Gods are known for their patience and their love of irony. What better weapon could they devise than a servant who genuinely believes he is working for the Emperor's salvation while actually bringing about his destruction? The cruelest tool is the one that does not know it is being used, and Cipher's apparent sincerity might be the most effective camouflage that the dark powers have ever created. The third theory, and perhaps the most philosophically interesting one, is that Cipher transcends simple categories of loyalty and treachery. In this interpretation, he is neither hero nor villain, neither loyalist nor traitor, but something else entirely, a force of change, and a catalyst whose purpose is to disrupt the stagnation that is slowly killing the Imperium. The Imperium of man, in the 41st millennium, is a dying empire. It is suffocating under the weight of its own dogma, its own bureaucracy, its own refusal to adapt or change. The ecclesiarchy crushes independent thought. The Mechanicus hoards technology. The Inquisition burns anyone who asks uncomfortable questions. The entire structure is designed to prevent change, and in doing so, it prevents the very adaptations that might save humanity from the threats that press in on all sides. Cipher, in this reading, is the antithesis of stagnation. He is change personified, disruption incarnate. He does not serve chaos, because chaos is itself a form of entropy, a descent into mindless dissolution, and he does not serve the Emperor, at least not the fossilized, worshipped version of the Emperor that the Imperium has created. He serves something older and deeper, the idea that humanity must evolve or die, must change or be destroyed, must embrace the uncomfortable and the unknown, or be consumed by the familiar darkness of its own making. The sword on his back, in this interpretation, is not just a weapon or a peace offering. It is a symbol, a reminder that even the mightiest institutions can be broken, but broken things can be reforged. The Lion Sword was shattered by Guilliman's anger and made whole again by Holgin's dedication. It was lost during the destruction of Caliban and somehow found its way to a hooded figure who has carried it across the galaxy for 10,000 years. It is the physical embodiment of the idea that destruction and creation are not opposites but partners, that sometimes something must be broken before it can be made stronger. Each of these theories has its merits and its flaws. Each is supported by some evidence and contradicted by other evidence. And that, ultimately, is the point. Cipher is not a puzzle to be solved. He is a mirror to be gazed into. What you see in him says as much about you as it does about him. If you believe the galaxy is redeemable, you see Cipher as a redeemer. If you believe the galaxy is doomed, you see Cipher as a destroyer. If you believe that the truth is always more complex than any simple narrative can contain, you see Cipher as a figure who embodies that complexity, who resists easy answers because easy answers are lies. In the end, the mystery of Cipher is not about a man in a hood carrying a sword. It is about the nature of truth in a universe built on lies. The Dark Angels lie to the Imperium about the fallen. The Imperium lies to its citizens about the Emperor. The Emperor, perhaps, lied to humanity about the nature of the warp and the chaos gods. Layer upon layer of deception, covering the raw, uncomfortable truth that the universe is not what anyone wants it to be. Cipher moves through these layers of deception like a needle through fabric, piercing each one, but never tearing the whole cloth apart. He is the one who knows the truth, or at least a truth, and his existence is a constant reminder that the official version of events is never the whole story. He is the living proof that the galaxy is more complicated than anyone in power wants to admit, and that the categories of loyal and traitor are far less meaningful than the Imperium pretends. And he is still out there, still walking, still carrying the sword he has never drawn, still heading toward a destination that was denied him but not forever. Not yet, the Emperor said. And Cipher, for once in his 10,000-year existence, did as he was told. But not yet is not never. And someday, perhaps someday soon, the time will be right. The sword will be drawn. The hooded figure will stand before the golden throne and fulfill whatever purpose has driven him across the stars for 100 centuries. What happens then? Nobody knows. Not the Dark Angels, not the Custodes, not the Lion, not even Cipher himself, perhaps. The future is unwritten, the ending unfinished, the final chapter of this incredible story yet to be told. And that uncertainty, that breathless, impossible suspense, stretched across 10,000 years of fictional history and decades of real-world speculation, is what makes Cipher not just the most mysterious character in Warhammer 40,000, but one of the most brilliantly conceived enigmas in all of science fiction. Part 12. The Enduring Riddle. Cipher in the wider context of 40,000. We have spent a long time together, you and I, walking through the shadows of the 41st millennium, following the footsteps of a figure who leaves no footprints. Before we part company, I want to step back and consider Cipher, not just as a character within the lore of Warhammer 40,000, but as a piece of creative storytelling that tells us something about the setting as a whole. Warhammer 40,000 is, at its heart, a setting built on ambiguity. Despite its reputation for black and white morality and over-the-top conflict, the richest parts of the lore are those that live in the grey areas. The Emperor, the supposed savior of humanity, is also its jailer, a tyrant who built an empire on lies, and whose greatest failure was his inability to trust his own sons with the truth. The Chaos Gods, the supposed villains of the setting, are reflections of human emotion and experience, impossible to destroy because they are, in a sense, part of what makes us who we are. The Imperium itself is simultaneously humanity's greatest achievement and its most terrible prison, a structure that preserves human civilization at the cost of everything that makes civilization worth preserving. Cipher fits into this landscape of ambiguity perfectly. He is the character who embodies the setting's refusal to provide easy answers. In a universe where every faction has its own propaganda and its own version of the truth, Cipher is the figure who stands outside all propaganda and possesses a truth that none of them can access. He is the outsider, the exile, the one who sees clearly because he has been forced to stand apart from all the institutions and ideologies that cloud everyone else's vision. His relationship with the Dark Angels is a perfect microcosm of the Imperium's broader pathologies. The Dark Angels are obsessed with their secret, so obsessed that they will sacrifice anything, including the lives of innocent Imperial citizens, to protect it. They hunt the fallen, not primarily to protect the Imperium from the threat the fallen represent, but to protect themselves from the shame of being exposed. Their hunt is driven by pride, not duty, by fear, not faith, by a desperate need to control the narrative, to ensure that the story of the Dark Angels is told the way they want it told, regardless of what actually happened. Cipher threatens all of this, not because he is powerful, though he is, not because he is dangerous, though he certainly is that as well. He threatens the Dark Angels because he is a walking reminder that their story is not what they claim it is. Every time he appears, every time he evades capture, every time he does something that contradicts the Dark Angels' narrative of absolute loyalty and unstained honor, he proves that the truth is more complicated than they want it to be. And that is why they cannot catch him. Not because he is too clever, or too lucky, or too well connected. Though all of those things may be true, they cannot catch him because catching him would require them to confront the truth about themselves. And that is the one thing the Dark Angels are constitutionally incapable of doing. Cipher lives in the truth. The Dark Angels live in denial. And denial, no matter how heavily armed, can never catch up with truth. This is what makes Cipher such a resonant character, not just within the fiction, but in the broader cultural conversation about secrets, lies, and the institutions that perpetuate them. He is the whistleblower that the powerful cannot silence, the inconvenient truth that refuses to go away, the skeleton in the closet that keeps walking out on its own no matter how many times you lock the door. In a universe of space marines and demons and god machines, Cipher reminds us that the most dangerous weapon is not a bolter or a sword or a planet-killing battleship. The most dangerous weapon is the truth, wielded by someone who has nothing left to lose. And with that, we come to the end of our journey together. We have traveled from Caliban to Terra and back again, through 10,000 years of war and secrecy and mystery. We have examined every piece of evidence, considered every theory, and arrived at the only conclusion that the evidence truly supports. We do not know who Cipher is. We do not know what he wants. We do not know whether the sword on his back is a weapon or a gift, whether his journey is a pilgrimage or an assassination mission, whether the day he finally reaches the Golden Throne will be humanity's salvation or its final doom. But we know that he is still out there, still walking, still carrying the blade he has never drawn, still heading toward a destination that was denied him, but not forever. And we know that when the moment finally comes, when the hooded figure stands before the Golden Throne and draws the lion sword for the first and perhaps the last time, the galaxy will hold its breath, because in that moment, everything will change, for better or worse, forever. That, my friends, is the mystery of Cipher, the Lord of the Fallen, the hooded ghost of the Dark Angels, the most enigmatic, the most enduring, and the most genuinely mysterious character in the history of Warhammer 40,000. Thank you for walking this path with me. Once if you enjoyed this journey into the shadows of the 41st millennium, consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories to tell, many more mysteries to explore, and many more dark corners of the Imperium to illuminate. Until next time, keep your hood up and your secrets close. In the grim darkness of the far future, you never know who might be listening. I will see you in the next one. Take care.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.